Our opening words today are from Rainer Maria Rilke from Letters to a Young Poet. Have patience with everything that remains unsolved in your heart. Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books written in a foreign language. Do not look now for answers. They cannot now be given to you because you could not live them. It is a question of experiencing everything. At present, you need to live in the question. Perhaps you will gradually, without even noticing it, find yourself experiencing the answer some distant day.
Join me in reading together, as printed in the order of service, the chalice lighting. This flame affirms the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment.
If you will please turn to number 496 at the back of the gray hymnal. I have some words from Reverend Harry Meserve. He's a distinguished Unitarian Universalist minister who, in time of his service, was with the First Unitarian in San Francisco. We'll read this in unison. From arrogance, pompousness, and from thinking ourselves more important than we are, may some saving sense of humor liberate us. For allowing ourselves to ridicule the faith of others, may we be forgiven. From making war and calling it peace, special privilege and calling it justice, indifference and calling it tolerance, pollution and calling it progress, may we be cured. For telling ourselves and others that evil is inevitable while good is impossible, may we stand corrected. God of our mixed up, tragic, aspiring, doubting, and insurgent lives, help us to be as good as in our hearts we have always wanted to be. Amen. Today we have two readings. The first is from Memories, Dreams, Reflections by Carl Jung. The decisive question for humanity is, are we related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of our lives. Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interest upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. Thus, we demand that the world grant us recognition for qualities which we regard as personal possessions, our talent or our beauty. The more an individual lays stress on false possessions, and the less sensitivity he or she has for what is essential, the less satisfying is his or her life. A human feels limited because he or she has limited aims, and the result is envy and jealousy. If we understand and feel that here in this life we already have a link with the infinite, desires and attitudes change. In the final analysis, we count for something only because of the essential we embody. And if we do not embody that, life is wasted. In our relationships to other people's too, the crucial question is whether an element of boundlessness is expressed in the relationship. And our second reading is from The Journey by Mary Oliver. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. Though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles, "Mend my life," each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save.
Please join me in the spirit of prayer and meditation. And new things, cried the prophet Isaiah, I now declare. We gather as a caring community, and in that spirit we are pleased and comforted to know that many of the candles lit this morning are of a celebratory nature. The accomplishment of an important goal, a milestone, an anniversary, some secret joy. Sharon Piekarski's first grandchild, Guinevere Jorgensen, Evie for short, was born on Friday, September 1st, and reporters declare that she is the most beautiful baby ever. Likewise, we commiserate with those among us who are lonely, suffering, or in distress. Whatever the secret reckonings of those who have lit candles of sorrow, they can be comforted knowing that we share their struggle with them, if silently. Beyond the walls of this place, we recognize that thousands, millions, countless others have longings and fears, just as do all of us. Others have pangs of conscience and feelings of overwhelm. The accelerating rapidity of change, the climate of political debasement, these things add up, leaving many hearts filled with uncertainty and fret. The extreme weather events of the season make clear that things are changing, and drastically. Even when we see that things are different, it is sometimes difficult as we do not know or understand exactly what it is. We only see that something has happened. Something is indeed different. Then there are times over generations when we have acted as if we were gods, when failures to understand and then to correct, once we have understood, catch up with us. We are all too quick to blame divine or cosmic forces and slow to recognize our contribution and, when appropriate, mend our ways. As the effects of global warming are felt around the world, it is easier to say an act of God than an act of humanity. Our failure to be proportionate and well-balanced in our assertions and truth claims does not help us to find a remedy. As we face the damage that Hurricane Harvey is wreaking on the American Gulf Coast, as most states in India and Mumbai suffer collapse of buildings and flooding, regions in Nepal and 1/3 of Bangladesh cope with monsoon flooding, which has killed more than 1,200 people and made millions homeless, as heavy rains flood Niamey, the capital of Niger in West Africa, as the second tropical storm in days hits southern China and Hong Kong. We pray that out of all this upheaval, new attitudes, new and more sustainable ways of living, good new things will take root and grow. May we do all we can to plant and nurture these new things now. Those of us living in the safety of the developed countries cannot easily fathom how Bangladesh has become a refuge to Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar fleeing nationalist persecution, how crossing the Mediterranean in unsafe boats offers for many a better chance at living than remaining in so many third world countries, how Brazil willingly opens environmental reserves to destructive mining in the Amazon basin. Give us a new understanding of wealth and safety, of plenty and deficiency, so that we stop taking more resources than we need from our planet. May we recognize the new things being declared right now, and may we come to live more gently and sustainably upon the earth. As we see the many heroes in their boats and other vessels in the flooded southern states, as we see the heroes of conservation protecting endangered species in Nepal, as we see heroes pull people from the seas of southern Europe and those who give them clothing, food, and respite, as we see those heroes who continue the work of caring long after the journalists have departed, in Freetown, Sierra Leone, dealing with the disastrous landslide, among rescue workers in the Alps landslide in Bondo, Switzerland, with medical workers in Yemen. We recognize the model of what our new and creatively transformed world will look like and how it will grow and thrive. For indeed, we see the declaration of new things all about us, and yet we also long for the declaration of new things now. So may they be revealed. Amen. And now, let us share silence together. Today I want to introduce myself to you. I want to share essentially where I'm coming from. I want to give you an idea what people and experiences have shaped and influenced my life so that you can weigh and evaluate and better understand what I'm trying to say, where I'm coming from, so you can decide whether you accept what I'm saying. You're welcome to challenge it. You know, that's the thing about a Unitarian church. Freedom of the pulpit. I'm allowed to say whatever I want. Within reason. I mean, but, you're basically, I can dictate what I want to preach against capital punishment, I can do it. I don't care if the president of the Board of Trustees thinks it's good, I can say what I want. And when the president of the Board of Trustees chooses to preach, she can say what she wants to, okay? And there's also the complementary freedom of the pew. That is, I can say what I want, you don't have to agree. You're welcome to evaluate and weigh it and decide. And that's what I'm inviting you to do. Now, I've narrowed my list of sources down to 15. But it could be many more or many fewer. As I go through them, think about what your sources are. What are the touchstones of your life? As for me, number one, geography. I was born on June 9th, 1950. I would say that's the pinnacle of the 20th century. It was 1950. A beautiful day, according to my mom. And throughout my life, June 9th has almost always been a beautiful day. Late spring, balmy, warm, and with still lengthening daylight. Where I was born, I feel, is important, or was important, still is. 2003 Chestnut Hills Drive, Cleveland Heights, Ohio. Now, Chestnut Hills is right along the line that demarks the edge of the Great Plains and the beginning of the Allegheny Plateau to the east, and to the west, 1,000 miles to the Front Range of Colorado. The late Vine Deloria Jr., author of about a dozen books, mostly Native American history and studies, including Custer Died for Your Sins and God is Red, held that people, all of us, are manifestations of the earth. Our beautiful hymn 303, I didn't sing it today, but we are the earth upright and proud. In us, the earth is growing and knowing. Ken Patton, a great humanist and hymnist, is echoing Vine Deloria's idea. Now, Vine went on to propose that people's dreams, their spirit, their whole way of connecting to life are all intimately connected to the land out of which they were born and grew up. And I think that's true for me. And where I come from is right on the line between east and west, looking west. So my first source is geography, and my second, too, is family. I was the third child. My dad was in World War II, and he and a lot of other guys came back and got married or had already been married and had a pestle of children. I was the third of four, but third in that birth order stuff, third children are generally called tag-alongs. There's some truth to that. Two older sisters who gladly helped let me come with them. I had two grandmothers, Grandma, my dad's mom, who was an MD. She'd gone to Johns Hopkins, Phi Beta Kappa, very impressive, but she was kind of stern. And she didn't have much of a bedside manner. She may have been a doctor, but she had brains, and she was descended from Mayflower and, minor revolutionary heroes. In the family myth that she perpetrated was they were less minor than all that. But for her, legacy was important, and I think I got my love from history from my grandmother. My other grandmother, Anya, had a much nicer lap. She was, Irish girl, sweet, no college, secretarial school. Grandma knew all the they both had beautiful gardens. Grandma's, she knew all the flowers in their Latin names. But Anya knew the common names and knew every animal that ever lived in Cleveland Heights and could see it out of the corner of her eye. And for her legacy, it's your heart, it's what you're doing right now. That's what matters, period. Now, I also had my dad had a sister who was disabled. My mom, and she lived with us some parts of the time. My mom's sister was married to she was kind of offbeat and smart too. And she and her offbeat equally husband were Freudian therapists. They lived in Berkeley. They had a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. And, when I first finally got out there and saw how they lived, it was an appealing alternative to the kind of conventional world that I was more familiar with in my mother and father's home. Now, memories of my mom, well, she had a beautiful singing voice, and she would sing during household chores, scrubbing the floor or doing the laundry, and some mothers sing hymns, and she would sing what she called torch songs, My Blue Heaven, Always, The Man I Love, that kind of thing. And I can't hear those songs without seeing Mom. She was also trained as a librarian, and she was a beautiful oral reader, this kind of seamless narratives, and she could take every voice and make it unique. I can't stay. You listen to Winnie the Pooh, on the. No, they get the voices all wrong. And she would read, A.A. Milne, The Wind in the Willows, that kind of stuff, and later stories about zany families coping and having fun. Please don't eat the daisies, cheaper by the dozen. And also more sensitive issues as we got older. To Kill a Mockingbird, for instance. We were all able to read, but Mom would read to us in the summers at night. I carried it on with my daughter until she gave up on it at about age 13. I remember the last story I read to her was A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, coming-of-age story about a young woman. And just as an aside, if you want your children to read to them. And if you want your children to like reading, have all kinds of books around your house. Coffee table books, cookbooks, travel books, biographies, science, you name it. The more you have, popular mechanics, the more your children will want to read. Now, my family was demonstrative and playful. My dad would what he called roughhousing or tricks on the living room floor. And we also had a cabin in about 100 miles east in northwest Pennsylvania, which we called the Fur Piece. It was here that I got acquainted with my fourth source, nature. So a third source was stories. I didn't quite make that clear. Mom read those stories. It's all the stories and narratives. My fourth source, we had this cabin, and we'd spend the summer there, and it was pretty funky. I mean, there was no plumbing, there was no heat or anything. It was a cabin. It was very rustic. But my dad built a tree house that was fabulous, up way high, and we would spend long summers. Later, we moved when I was 7, and the house we moved to was a bigger house, and it was across the street from a beautiful wooded park, Shaker Lakes. And I would play there all the time, alone, or I was supposed to only go with a buddy, but sometimes I would go alone. And just playing in the water and building little boats and like that. I enjoyed many urban civilized things too, pop culture and pop heroes, cowboys especially. The Lone Ranger was my first hero. I often think of that in this interim work, because you kind of come in and then you leave and people go, who was that masked man? I enjoy baseball. Cleveland Indians center fielder Jimmy Pearsall, who just died a couple of months ago, was my favorite player for years. He kind of was an emotional wreck, but that's made us love him all the more. And I still love baseball, and I still am consoled and held dear by nature. Another source, 5, though I wouldn't have acknowledged it at the time, was my Unitarian Universalist church. My parents and the church held liberal social and economic views. They were, my dad was a businessman, but they were Republicans, but they were, it's kind of a non-existent anymore, but they were liberal Republicans. Rockefeller Republicans, you might have remembered hearing about. But they were pro-civil rights, pro-labor, they were United World Federalists. Now, this Unitarian church that I grew up in Shaker Heights was not your everyday church. It had 500 kids in the Sunday school. They had double services every Sunday, and the minister of music was Robert Shaw, the Robert Shaw Chorale. And the music was incomparable, just fabulous. And I remember you'd have to get there early so you could get a seat, because it was like the Cleveland Orchestra on Sunday for free. Now, I remember when I was in 8th grade, I think, my best friend, Billy Wallace, and I were walking home, and he was at St. Paul's Episcopal, and he was doing confirmation. And when we were talking about something that they'd been talking about in their class, some ethical dilemma, I don't know. And along the way, I said, well, the Christian thing to do. And he interrupted me. He said, you're not a Christian. Now, this was news to me. I realized that it was a humanistic church, and that Bob Killam, the senior minister, was a humanist. But when I used that term, the Christian, I was meaning kind of small c, the good thing to do, the right thing to do, the aspirational thing to do, which is the religion that I grew up with. Now, my parents' modernist views included respect for the work of Sigmund Freud. And my 6th source is the first one that is essentially an idea: unconscious motivation. The idea that people are motivated by passions that are often unknown even to themselves, compelled in certain directions, and they're not sure why. My dad, for all his charm and accomplishments, which were many, suffered from recurrent depressions. When I was 8, he left academia and went into the corporate world. Suddenly, he was away a lot on business. His problems with depression and my simultaneous flirtations with delinquency led my offbeat Aunt Fran to recommend to my mom family therapy. And this was kind of radical, especially in Cleveland at that time, but kind of on the model of Virginia Satir and other early family systems therapists, family systems analysts and therapists. Now, Freud's great insight, and Virginia Satir and other early family systems therapists still came out of the Freudian model. His great insight was this, that people are motivated by deep unconscious influences and impulses. And now they can be brought to consciousness. People can grow in insight and become more revealed to themselves, more self-aware. As the Beat poet Charles Olson said, we do not change, we only stand more revealed to ourselves and willing to be more transparent with others. The strong civil rights emphasis at the Shaker Heights Unitarian Church, plus a variety of personal factors, led my mom in the mid-60s to go back to work as an inner-city librarian. And for the next 25 years, in the Huff area for about half of that, which is Cleveland's most kind of economically depressed and ghettoized area, and other branches as well. And interesting, she was one of the few working mothers I knew. Meanwhile, I became very involved in activities at the local YMCA and later the Boy Scouts of America. Glenn Payne, the director at the Y, and Carl Brew, my scoutmaster, were wonderful role models, and in their way, excellent surrogate dads. I became, over the years, quite adept and able at recognizing people like that and reaching out to them. Boy Scouts I loved. Scouts also inspired my what's it called, kind of my social climbing aspect. I made it to Eagle, and I enjoyed that achievement and the idea of further achievement by virtue of hard work. It was fun to succeed. Also important in who I became were some great teachers, Mr. Freed, Mrs. Goodwin, Mr. Olson, Miss Landau. These public school teachers were excellent. They encouraged me to pursue excellence and stimulated my ambition. And that ambition, now that my social climbing aspect was in gear, included getting into a test school, a private boys' high school, and high achievement. In the summer of '65, I landed my first job at the Boy Scout, at the Beaumont Scout Reservation. And the two things come down from that. First of all, the director was a fool. But that was a wonderful lesson because it taught me worker solidarity. We all kind of organized to make the camp run in spite of the yo-yo who ran it. And I was the youngest guy in the staff, so I had the crummiest job, which was I worked in the commissary selling Hostess Twinkies and that kind of thing to the campers, you know. But the director of the commissary, Bob Urban, loved folk music. And he rigged up a primitive component stereo system and had all these folk singers, the Kingston Trio, Peter, Paul, and Mary, but especially he really liked the Nobel laureate, Bob Dylan. Of course, we didn't know he was going to be a Nobel laureate, and it was weird stuff, but you listen to it again and again and again. So this is my eighth source, poetry. The use of imagery to activate the right hemisphere. I had read in school and memorized The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and a half dozen other poems, that kind of thing. But it wasn't until I started listening to Dylan that I began to understand what poetry is actually about, learning to think and experience metaphorically. If you seek understanding, said my favorite seminary teacher, Bernie Loomer, forget about the philosophers. Go to the poets. Walt Whitman. There was a child went forth every day, and the first object he looked upon, that object he became. And that object became part of him for the day, or a certain part of the day, or for many years, or stretching cycles of years. The early lilacs became part of this child, and grass, and white and red morning glories, and white and red clover, and the song of the phoebe bird, and the fish suspending themselves so curiously below there, and the beautiful, curious liquid, and the water plants and their graceful flat heads all became part of him. His own parents, he that had fathered him, and she that had conceived him in her womb and birthed him, they gave this child more of themselves than that. They gave him afterward every day. They became part of him. The family usages, the language, the company, the furniture, the yearning and swelling heart, affection that will not be gainsaid. These became a part of that child who went forth every day and now goes and will always go forth every day. In seminary, I studied the writings of George Herbert Mead, a pioneer social psychologist who taught at the University of Chicago in the early 20th century. He's actually the first faculty member hired at Chicago. Mead writes with great insight about how self-conscious awareness happens, how objects and people outside of us become incorporated internally, how they become us, as the Transcendentalist Unitarian poet Walt Whitman poetically described 75 years earlier. We, individuals, become objects to ourselves too, which can, all too often, lead one to lose touch with his or her still inner voice. You end up understanding, people tell you what you look like. Oh, you're so good looking, you're such a clever lad, blah, 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 and you integrate that and you take it in. There's all the more reason why you have to be very careful not to give negative messages to children about how can you be so dumb? What's the you're going to be a failure if you don't. None of that helps. None of it. We internalize what we're told. Now, poetry speaks instead to that initial inner voice and has a way of drawing it out self-expressively. I had a great high school experience. The mid-'60s were in full swing. Great music was a big part of that, the British invasion, Motown. I listened exclusively to CKLW out of Windsor, Ontario, but the music was all Motown. There was a joint downtown at 85th and Euclid, Leo's Casino, and I saw so many, all the great acts from Aretha, the Temptations, all of them. And Dick Gregory said that Leo's, of course, I didn't know Dick then, said it was the most integrated nightclub in America. And it was great. It was great. But also dances at the local Armory, Boston Mills, Vermilion, Mentor on the Lake, Ohio. All this was exciting, fun, and cool. I also was a pretty good athlete. I was captain of the cross-country team. I lettered in track. I wrestled. And I guess my initial theology, if I could go back to when I'm 14, 15, 16, I would call it jockstrap theology. And here's what I mean. I discovered that if I gave it my all, we had training rules that you weren't supposed to drink, you weren't supposed to smoke cigarettes, you were supposed to go to bed by midnight. I never paid attention to the last, but I didn't smoke cigarettes, I didn't have anything to drink during the season, and what I discovered was if you gave it your very all, everything, you went right to the wall, you can be met there by something bigger than yourself. You can't short-circuit it. You can't count on that. You have to go to the wall. But when you get there, you discover new places of empowerment. Even cooler, I was involved in theater, and I discovered in theater you can have that experience collectively, where you're all at your limit. I was in a Euripides Bacchae once in the Greek chorus, and you learn these chants, and you go over them. Aeschylus was, universalizing the Dionysian cult, and you say these things. They were actually ancient prayers. And one night, Dionysus appeared. Now, what is it? Was that collective imagination? I don't know what it was, but we saw it. We all saw. And that was a good performance. The greatest of my high school teachers, however, had to be love. My first flame. Well, not really my first flame. I had infatuations, but Helen Roby, and we both came from mildly dysfunctional, well, pretty dysfunctional families, but we discovered each other, and it was just a wonderful breakthrough from isolation. I'm always amazed when I think about, we talked on the phone for, God, so long. What did we talk about? And shared our dreams, and it was all very wholesome and Midwestern and well scrubbed. I mean, it wasn't all of that sexy, a little sexy, but mostly just deep, abiding friendship. I graduated from high school in 1968, so that's my 10th Sorth, just that year. The year they took the lid off. I mean, it was a terribly powerful chain of events. It started with the Tet Offensive in January, which kind of revealed that our government had been lying to us a lot about Vietnam. Martin Luther King and then Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. The Chicago Convention was a disaster. There were other assassinations. Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader in Chicago, and several others murdered by the FBI. And it all served to radicalize me politically. It was a very disruptive year also. It wasn't just a political event. Personally, it was a tough time. In about a period of 6 months, my dog got hit by a drunk and killed. Helen and I split up. I graduated from high school. My father committed suicide. And we moved, and I went off to college. I kind of go, when I think about it, if I ever scripted it, it would be in a set, and there'd be the sets around the outside, and they'd just fall over. They'd just fall over. Is that what it felt like? And then you had to go to college and try to find your niche, and it was a little hard. But the late 60s was a great time to go to college if you were lucky enough to do it. My freshman year, naturally enough, was problematic, but I soon got squared away. I made good friends. I had fabulous teachers. One of them, J. Gomer Williams, helped me understand and integrate my next source, which people sometimes ask me, well, why did you become a minister? What led you? And the glib answer is so much deeper and more complex than this, but if I'm in that kind of mood, I'll say, oh, LSD. My senior year, having completed all my requirements for my history major and having taken the law boards, I decided to take a bunch of religion classes. And meanwhile, I was comfortable enough, I thought, well, everybody's talking about this LSD, I'll try some. And now, get it, I want you to get it, it was never part of my lifestyle. It was part of my life. And I went to Mr. Williams and I said, hey, what am I supposed to make of these extraordinary experiences? He said, well, what about them? And I tried to explain, and he turned me on, he gave me a copy of The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. He said, Carl Jung maybe can help. Now, Alan Watts said of LSD, when you get the message, hang up the phone. And that's exactly how I treated it. You know, I think here in the Bay Area, there were a lot of druggy refugees, you know, especially in Berkeley, kind of littering the streets. But more often, people just, they got the message, they hung up the phone, they began to understand that it's about service, it's not about, accumulation. And some of the basic insights that came to me and came also through Carl Jung. I just read about half of what he wrote, which is a lot. And he provided a framework by which I could integrate these remarkable inner experiences into a deep cultural context. William Blake, Meister Eckhart, and back to the ancient philosophers. Carl Jung provided my first flashlight to help me find my way through the labyrinthine mystery of the psyche. Jung's major contribution, introvert and extrovert, those two terms, but this idea of the collective unconscious, that Freud posits a personal unconscious, and that is below the threshold of awareness, but there's material down there that influences how we think. And you can access this, but it costs a lot of money, and you've got to go to Freudian therapy for 5 years. And Jung has another model. It's a talking depth therapy, but less intensive. His idea is that it's like people are all islands, but below the sea level, they're all connected, all right? And so our personal unconscious gives way internally to a deeper kind of a collective unconscious. And sometimes people go, oh, is that some kind of mystical grab bag? No, it's what we share collectively, our body shape and type, and of that of which we're unconscious, that we are the earth upright and proud most of the time. We don't pause to think about that. You think about the bills that are due, about not cutting off this guy in spite of he tried to cut you off, and that kind of thing. Our mind is much more preoccupied with minutia in front of our face. The important thing, and as important as reading Carl Jung was, even more important was my favorite teacher and mentor, John Robert Mattingly. He was a Latin teacher, a classicist. He employed the Socratic method with love in his ancient civilization class. I mean, he was a true philosopher, always learning. And he would give modest assignments, 20 pages or something. Say, now you come with questions, and if you don't have questions for me, I'll have questions for you. And that you did not want. Because, as I said, he was a Socratic maven. And he would just keep asking you questions until you realized you didn't know what you were talking about. And you were becoming more and more of a fool. And it was very embarrassing, especially if you were trying to defend the stupid things you were thinking all along. But as soon as he did, kind of went, oh, shucks, Mr. Manning, I don't know. I did read the reading, but I don't know. You know, he would go, now let's go looking for truth together. And so the ego gets put aside, and the spirit and the intellect and the life of the mind is suddenly engaged. In the 2 years following graduation, and really until they both died, I spent many weekends with Mr. and Mrs. Mattingly. She was equally impressive and taught Latin at the local high school. And you know, and the story is they met in a Sanskrit translating contest that he lost, and she won, and he was damned if he was going to lose that prize. So they, just amazing, and people. And then I left for California and seminary. I said that I did a little interim of 2 years in Washington, D.C., right during Watergate. It was kind of cool. I mean, I worked in the House of Representatives. It wasn't a big deal. I was running an elevator and later in the post office. But it was a ringside seat and close enough to know I don't really want to do this. It's not me. And California looked cool. I had more good teachers at seminary, one in particular who became my colleague, Paul Sawyer. Some of you may know him. He was minister at the Berkeley Fellowship throughout the 80s and later in Pasadena. But he was a teacher and then a colleague and always a mentor. 3 other sources. Number 13 would have to be the many special congregants that I've known over the years, women and men who've taught me how to be a good minister. Yes, I did learn a few things in seminary, reading theology, studying church history, and the like. I also learned a lot from my intern supervisor, Reverend David O. Rankin at the San Francisco Unitarian Church. And I've learned a lot reading Alban Institute books and about congregational life. But when it comes to actually practicing parish ministry, by far my best teachers, and there have been many, have been the balanced, caring, and hardworking church members over the years that helped me learn this ancient craft. I could name a lot of them, but that would require another service. But it's congregants who teach you how to be a minister, and they teach you sometimes rather abruptly. They say, no, that's not working. Or you have to go visit the widow Brown. She's sick, and you haven't visited her. I didn't even know there was such a person. You have to go. Shall I show you where? Okay. And maybe that's New England, where my first solo church was. But it's not only there that I learned all what's necessary and what's needed. Number 14 is one particular member of my family that deserves a place of her own, and that's my daughter, Meredith, now a psychiatric social worker, 37 years of age, and a mother of 2 children herself. The joys and terrors of parenthood, what can I say? It teaches you a lot about what's important hanging in there, and what's not, keeping up with the Joneses or their materialistic offspring. Our children see us better and more accurately than almost anyone else. They recognize their parents' gifts and limitations as well as anyone. They are biologically programmed to love their parents unequivocally if their parents only pay attention. And not too much attention, becoming helicopter moms and dads in the process. Sing to them and read to them like my mother did. Make your home a welcoming place for their friends. One doesn't need a fancy home, just a warm one, filled with music and laughter and honest expression of emotion. This isn't to say that discipline or order are not important. They are very important. But such need never be harsh, only fair, and directed toward keeping one's whole family system on an even keel, and where everyone, children included, contribute to the greater family good and to the neighborhood as well. Mostly it was my daughter Meredith who taught me all of these things. One last source goes without saying, but still has to be held up, my dearest friends. At the top of that list is my partner, Carol Allen. Many other friends, too, have been important throughout my life. Indeed, close friends are the most concrete example of grace that I have ever known. Just as I've learned a lot from love, I've also learned a lot when my heart has been broken. And friends were there to commiserate, to help me through. When I've had struggles at work, when my father died, always friends have helped me through. Friends to argue with, to joust, dialogue, vent in front of, or just go fishing with. Show me your friends, and I'll show you whom you are, my grandfather Papa used to say. I've been blessed with good, close friends all my life. These places, these people, and events have all contributed to who I have become. They are my sources. They are me. Who are you? That's what Lewis Carroll keeps asking Alice. Who are you? Good question. Who and what and where are your sources? How did nature, poetry, stories, and your families nurture and encourage or thwart and try to prevent the unfoldment of each of your personalities? What other touchstones were there and are there now? Think about it and let me know. And then as I learned to do with my mentor, Mr. Mattingly, we can begin to transverse the infinite landscape of our souls together. So may it be. Shalom. Amen. Namaste. I hate it that you're way over there. But we'll fix that as time goes on. What we call a beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. We shall not cease from exploration. And the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Amen.